Imagine the heat of the Levant sun baking stone walls as cries of victory echo through Jerusalem's narrow, blood-slicked streets. It is July 1099. Crusaders, having crossed continents driven by faith, fear, and ambition, have seized the holy city. They walk among corpses, Saracen, Jew, and even fellow Christians caught in the storm. To them, this is not a massacre, it is deliverance. But what now? The First Crusade, that chaotic blend of pilgrimage and conquest, had ended with glory for some and questions for all. Europe had sent its sons, and many had not returned. Those who did returned, different, hardened, broken, or exalted. Those who remained behind heard tales too wild to believe and too sacred to doubt battles won by visions of saints. Angels at Antioch, the blood of infidels knee-deep in Jerusalem. In Europe, church bells rang in triumph. In the East, ashes settled. The kingdom of Jerusalem was born not through diplomacy or divine providence, but through steel and siege. A Latin Christian enclave carved out of a hostile world, surrounded on all sides by powers who watched, waited, and would not forget. And among them, to the north and east, lay Edessa, a city older than Rome, touched by apostles, soaked in scripture and blood alike. It was the first crusader state, an anomaly on the frontier. Its walls, while sturdy, guarded more than stone. They shielded the fragile hope that what was taken by faith could be held by force. This is the story of that hope, of Edessa's rise, of its pride, and of its fall. Let us begin. Edessa was not Jerusalem. It lacked the relics, the shrines, the fevered reverence. But it was vital, strategically perched near the Euphrates. It served as a northern bulwark, a Christian stronghold amid the growing tide of Islamic resurgence. After the First Crusade, Baldwin of Boulogne, brother to Godfrey of Bouillon, became its ruler. Styling himself Count of Edessa, he was no monk. Baldwin knew warfare, manipulation, and the power of marriage. Through cunning and arms, he secured Edessa not just as a crusader outpost, but as a functioning, if fragile, polity. Latin Christians lived alongside Armenians, Syriacs, and even Muslims. The arrangement was tense. It was never meant to last. Still, for decades, it endured. Pilgrims passed through. Merchants traded silk for silver, and knights dreamed of further conquests. The West sent reinforcements, but fewer each year. Europe had celebrated. Europe had moved on, but the East had not. Beyond the horizon, a storm brewed. In the Muslim world, the Crusades were first a shock, then a call, from Damascus to Mosul. Rulers recognized the Frankish presence not as a miracle, but as an insult, and chief among them was Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, a warrior of fierce discipline and brutal ambition. He saw Edessa not just as a city, but as a symbol. To retake Edessa would be to show Islam was not defeated, that the Crusaders were not invincible, that jihad was not a memory, but a fire to be rekindled. And so, by the early 1140s, Zengi began to move. He consolidated power in the region, forging alliances and breaking them when convenient. His army swelled not merely with soldiers, but with cause. Unlike the infighting Franks, Zengi's rhetoric was simple. The Franks were invaders, foreigners, polluters of holy land. In Edessa, meanwhile, complacency reigned. Its current ruler, Jocelyn II, was a man more adept at diplomacy than warfare. He relied on the city's walls, its past victories, its distant allies. When he marched north with much of his army to support a fellow Christian prince, he left Edessa vulnerable. Zengi saw his chance. In late 1144, he surrounded Edessa. His army encamped before its walls, cutting off trade, hope, and breath. Inside the city, panic spread. Appeals were sent to Antioch, to Jerusalem, even to Europe, but distance is a cruel ally. Reinforcements would not come in time. Zengi's siege engines battered the walls. His soldiers dug tunnels, burned supports, and breached defenses. On December 24th, the walls gave way. Edessa fell. Thousands died. Churches were desecrated. Christians were slaughtered or enslaved. The crusader dream of a Christian East was shattered not in glorious battle, but in screaming streets and burning sanctuaries. And Europe was stunned. The fall of Edessa marked the first great loss of crusader territory. The myth of invincibility cracked. The Holy Land was no longer secure, and in the cathedrals and courts of Europe, the call began again, not a new beginning, but a response, a second crusade. But that is for another part. For now, let us remain in the ashes of Edessa and ask what went wrong. The fall of Edessa was not just a military failure, it was a moral and symbolic catastrophe. For decades, the Crusader states had operated under the illusion of permanence, sustained by fortresses, alliances, and prayer. Edessa's collapse shattered that illusion. It revealed the vulnerability not just of stone walls, but of the very idea that faith alone could preserve a foreign kingdom on hostile soil. News traveled slowly, but hit with the force of thunder once it reached the cloisters and courts of Europe. Monasteries mourned. Kings held council. The Church, for all its divine authority, had no illusions about the magnitude of the loss. If Jerusalem was the heart of Christendom's conquest, Edessa had been its outstretched hand, now severed. In the court of Pope Eugenius III, the decision was swift but not easy. He knew that a response was needed. Silence would be interpreted as weakness, inaction as defeat. And so, he turned to one of the most compelling figures of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was no soldier. He was a monk, a Cistercian, austere and uncompromising, with eyes like burning coals and a voice that turned crowds into armies. Where popes failed to inspire, Bernard succeeded. He preached not with swords, but with scripture, not with orders, but with revelations. And in 1146, when he mounted the pulpit at Vézelay in Burgundy, thousands gathered. It is said that the crowd wept, that nobles tore strips of cloth from their clothes to mark themselves with the cross, that even King Louis VII of France, troubled by guilt over a failed war and anxious to regain moral authority, knelt before Bernard and took the vow. The Second Crusade had begun not as a whisper, but as a roar. But Edessa was already gone, and what lay ahead was not redemption, but complication. In the east, Zengi did not live to see the full fruits of his conquest. He was assassinated in 1146, likely by a servant or rival. His legacy, however, was secure. His son, Nur ad-Din, would inherit both his territories and his vision, a unified Muslim resistance against the Crusader states. In Edessa, the Latin presence had been extinguished. Attempts to recapture it would fail. It was not merely a lost city, it was a lost foothold. The terrain had shifted. The war had changed. Meanwhile, in Europe, the machinery of crusades sputtered into motion. Knights sold lands, towns levied taxes, preachers spread across the countryside. The Holy Land, once seen as conquered, was now framed as endangered, and many with no understanding of Edessa or Zengi or even Jerusalem took up arms in a cause they believed to be sacred. But the Second Crusade would not go as planned. That too is a story to be told. For now, we sit amid the ruins. In Edessa, smoke still rises. In Europe, armor is fastened. In the heavens, silence reigns, and the cross, once triumphant, begins to tremble beneath the weight of the sword. But even as Europe answered the call, the Holy Land was not waiting in quiet. After the fall of Edessa, the remaining Crusader states knew what was at stake. Antioch and Tripoli were nervous neighbors, their leaders wary of each other as much as of their Muslim rivals. Jerusalem, the jewel of Christendom in the east, stood proud but increasingly isolated. King Baldwin III, a young monarch wise beyond his years, understood the fragility of what they had built. He saw that stone walls could be breached, alliances fray, and faith falter. He pressed for unity among the crusader states, but ambition often spoke louder than reason. In the shadows, Nur ad-Din rose not just as a warrior, but as a visionary. Unlike many rulers of the Muslim world at the time, Nur ad-Din saw the potential of unity not merely as a political tool, but as a spiritual imperative. He called for jihad, yes, but tempered it with justice, education, and reform. He built schools, patronized scholars, and prayed as fiercely as he fought. His goal was not just victory, it was restoration. To the Latin Christians, he was a formidable enemy. But to many in the Islamic world, he was a restorer of dignity. His father's conquest of Edessa had opened the door. Nur ad-Din intended to walk through it. Meanwhile, across Europe, the machinery of the Second Crusade ground forward, but it lacked the unifying clarity of the First. Unlike Pope Urban II's stirring vision of reclaiming Jerusalem, the Second Crusade was complicated by loss and confusion. Most crusaders had never even heard of Edessa. Why should they die for a city that no longer existed? Yet still, they came. From France, King Louis VII marched with a host of knights and lords, spurred on by Bernard's firebrand sermons and his own bruised reputation. From Germany, Emperor Conrad III led a force of his own. Their routes diverged, their goals were murky, and their coordination was abysmal. Crossing into Byzantine lands, the Crusaders faced suspicion and sabotage. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, was no friend to the Latin West. He had watched the First Crusade pass through with uneasy eyes. This second wave, armed and arrogant, threatened more than it promised. He offered supplies, yes, and passage, but only just. What followed was a march riddled with hardship, bad weather, poor logistics, local hostility. An infighting tore at the Crusader ranks. Conrad's army, ambushed in Anatolia, was nearly destroyed. Louis fared little better. By the time both kings limped into Antioch, their forces were a shadow of their former glory. And then came the questions where to strike Edessa was unrecoverable. The best target, militarily and politically, was Damascus, a powerful Muslim city, but one that had, at times, allied with the Crusaders against common enemies. It was a fateful choice. The siege of Damascus in 1148 was a disaster. Poor planning, lack of coordination, and strong defense turned what might have been a triumph into a rout. Within days, the Crusaders were retreating. Blame flew like arrows. Trust crumbled, and with it, the dream of a second holy victory. The Crusaders returned home, disillusioned and diminished. Their legacy was not glory, but embarrassment, and in their failure, Nur ad-Din saw opportunity. He strengthened his hold on Syria, pushed deeper into the Levant, and laid the foundation for a campaign that would, in time, shake even the walls of Jerusalem. As the dust settled, the fall of Edessa took on a deeper meaning. It was not merely the loss of a city, but a turning point in the Crusader experiment. It exposed the limits of European resolve, the dangers of overreach, and the resilience of those who called the region home. It also marked the rise of new voices, both in the East and the West. Chroniclers began to question the wisdom of these holy wars. Poets mourned not just the dead, but the dream. And among the survivors, a different understanding began to take root, that perhaps conquest was not salvation, that perhaps the cross and the sword were never meant to walk hand in hand. But such realizations come slowly, and war, once begun, rarely fades quietly. In the years that followed the failed Second Crusade, the ripples of Edessa's fall continued to widen. While Europe grieved and reassessed, the Levant evolved. The Muslim world, long fractured by dynastic disputes and tribal rivalries, began to coalesce not through brute force, but through strategy, diplomacy, and, in many cases, faith. At the heart of this consolidation stood Nur ad-Din. His court in Aleppo was a center of both piety and power, where mullahs and military commanders shared space. He funded hospitals, supported the study of hadith, and ensured his campaigns carried both the sword and the sermon. His rule was not merely reactionary, it was visionary. To his subjects, he was a just ruler. To his enemies, a relentless threat. And to the crusader states, he was the herald of a new era, one that would no longer suffer the Latin presence in silence. The Latin East, meanwhile, faced internal challenges. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though intact, suffered from dynastic disputes. Baldwin III, though capable, struggled to exert full control. His mother, Queen Melisende, held considerable power, and the tension between their factions only deepened existing cracks in the Crusader political order. In Antioch, the situation was worse. Following the death of Raymond of Poitiers at the Battle of Inab in 1149, cut down by Nur ad-Din's forces in a decisive ambush, the principality lost both leadership and morale. Antioch's borders shrank, and its prestige waned. The loss of its prince was not just a military blow, but a psychological one. It proved that no fortress, no matter how storied, was immune. Raymond's head was sent to Nur ad-Din, who had it displayed in triumph, a grim reminder of the shifting tides. Amid this chaos, the Christian states were forced into a more defensive posture. Castles were reinforced, alliances reconsidered, and raids became more common than battles. The optimism of the First Crusade gave way to grim pragmatism. Diplomacy, once dismissed, became essential. Some Crusader leaders sought truces with Muslim rulers. Marriages were proposed, embassies exchanged. There were moments, however fleeting, where coexistence seemed not just possible, but necessary. Yet behind every treaty loomed the memory of Edessa, a constant reminder that peace was temporary and war inevitable. And so the years passed, marked not by triumphs, but by tensions. Pilgrims still arrived in Jerusalem, drawn by faith and myth. Monks still sang at dawn, and priests still blessed the fields. But the sense of divine favor had dimmed. The Crusader states had been shown their limits. Back in Europe, the disappointment of the Second Crusade festered. Bernard of Clairvaux, once the lion of the pulpit, faced harsh criticism. Some accused him of overreach, others of spiritual manipulation. In his letters, Bernard defended the crusade bitterly, claiming the failure was due to the sins of the Crusaders, not the mission itself, but the damage to his reputation lingered. Even so, the idea of crusade did not die. It could not. It was too deeply embedded in theology, in politics, in identity. The memory of Jerusalem still stirred hearts. The pain of Edessa still demanded redress. And far to the south, in Egypt, the seeds of an even greater confrontation were being planted. For while the Latin West and the Muslim East stared at each other across fortified borders, a new player would soon emerge. A man of Kurdish origin, trained in war but guided by restraint. A man who would unify Egypt and Syria under a single banner. A man whose name would echo from Cairo to Constantinople, from Paris to Baghdad. But that is a tale for another part. Here, at the close of part 1, we return to Edessa, not the city, but the idea, the dream of permanence in an impermanent land, the belief that walls and crosses could hold against centuries of history and faith. Its fall was not just a moment, it was a message, that even in holy wars, nothing is secure, and that sometimes a loss tells the story better than a victory ever could. The fall of Edessa had rewritten the geography of faith and fear in the Levant. In the vacuum it left behind, a new force emerged unified not by conquest alone, but by ideology, reform, and the strategic vision of one man, Nur ad-Din Zengi. Unlike the Crusader kings who relied on foreign reinforcements, Nur ad-Din cultivated local loyalty. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also a scholar's patron, a mosque builder, and a figure of piety who envisioned something few had dared to articulate openly: a united Muslim front against the Crusader states. From his court in Aleppo, he launched campaigns not merely to expand territory, but to reforge a fractured Islamic world. Syria, long divided among competing dynasties and lords, began to cohere. His rhetoric, grounded in Sunni orthodoxy, emphasized not only jihad against the Franks, but internal purification, rooting out corruption, enforcing justice, and reviving Islamic institutions weakened by years of decentralization. Nur ad-Din was deliberate. He did not race toward Jerusalem. He knew that to confront the Latin states effectively, he needed to secure his rear Aleppo, Homs, Hama, Damascus, and forge legitimacy not through bloodlines, but through law, order, and religious authority. And it worked. Cities that once resisted Zengi's rule now welcomed his son. Ulema Islamic scholars supported his vision. Mosques preached unity, not local ambition. When Nur ad-Din entered Damascus in 1154, it was not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. To the Crusader states, this was deeply alarming. For decades, they had counted on Muslim disunity. Tribal infighting, succession crises, and ethnic divisions had fragmented the Islamic response. Now, those cracks were sealing. The landscape was changing. To understand the stakes, we must consider what Nur ad-Din was building: not an empire, but a moral polity, a kind of Islamic state that claimed not just lands, but the right to define the struggle. His version of jihad was not bloodlust. It was systemic, spiritual, institutional, a duty of rulers and ruled alike. This was a language the Crusader lords could not match. While Nur ad-Din built hospitals, founded madrasas, and expanded public works, the Latin rulers quarreled. Baldwin III had finally asserted dominance over his mother, Queen Melisende, but his reign remained unstable. In Antioch, the lack of leadership after Raymond's death created power vacuums. And in Tripoli, petty disputes undermined larger strategy. They still held Jerusalem, yes, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of war. That rhythm now beat from Aleppo, and just as importantly, Nur ad-Din understood optics. He did not flaunt wealth, he dressed simply. He visited the wounded. When his officials embezzled, he punished them. He was the rare kind of ruler feared by enemies and admired by allies. And so, by the late 1150s, a new order was emerging in the Levant, one in which the Crusaders could no longer assume Muslim fragmentation, one in which the old defensive posture of the Latin states build castles. Wait for reinforcements was no longer enough, but Nur ad-Din, for all his power, knew he had limits. To the south, in Egypt, a different struggle played out. The Fatimid Caliphate, once a beacon of Shia power, was in decline. Its bureaucracy was ossified. Its generals quarreled. Its legitimacy eroded. And it held a prize Nur ad-Din coveted Cairo. To hold Egypt meant controlling the southern flank of the Crusader states. It meant surrounding the Latin kingdoms with a crescent of coordinated power, and it meant reshaping the Islamic world in Nur ad-Din's vision. But Egypt was not a fruit to be picked. It was a battlefield of its own, and it would take someone extraordinary to seize it, someone Nur ad-Din had yet to discover, someone the world would one day call Saladin. It was not in Aleppo or Jerusalem that the future was forged, but in the sands and intrigues of Egypt. By the early 1160s, Egypt was a kingdom adrift. The Fatimid Caliphate, once glorious in its Ismaili Shia majesty, had dwindled into a relic of rituals and courtly decadence. Its viziers held the true power, often more ruthless than any caliph they served. One such figure, Shawar, rose to prominence only to be ousted by a rival named Dergham. Desperate and exiled, Shawar fled to seek aid from none other than Nur ad-Din. It was a strange alliance, a Sunni emir supporting a Shia vizier, yet Nur ad-Din saw opportunity. Egypt was rich, Egypt was strategically vital, and Egypt, if claimed, would allow him to hem in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem from both the north and the south. He dispatched his most trusted general Shirkuh, a man of ambition, corpulence, and unyielding resolve. And with Shirkuh rode his nephew, a younger figure who had shown talent but not yet greatness. His name Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The world would remember him as Saladin. The campaign to control Egypt unfolded like a game of chess played with poisoned pieces. As Shirkuh and Shawar marched into Egypt to reclaim the vizierate, King Amalric of Jerusalem also saw his chance. He, too, invaded Egypt, citing defense of the Christian realm, but motivated by the same thing as Nur ad-Din control. Thus began a deadly three-sided struggle: Fatimid loyalists, Sunni reformers, and Crusader knights collided across the delta. Battles flared, truces were betrayed, cities burned. Shawar, once restored to power with Shirkuh's help, quickly turned against his benefactors and allied with Amalric. Then, fearing betrayal by the Crusaders, he again sought Shirkuh's help. Egypt became a revolving door of armies and ambitions. In the end, treachery undid Shawar. Shirkuh took Cairo in 1169 and Shawar was executed. But Shirkuh, barely able to enjoy his triumph, died shortly thereafter. And then, in the swirling dust of succession, Saladin stepped forward. He was young, he was foreign, he was untested as a ruler, and yet, in the power vacuum left by Shirkuh, he was appointed vizier. Few thought he would last. Fewer still believed he would shape the future of two worlds. But Saladin, soft-spoken and calculating, began to dismantle Fatimid power from within. He replaced officials with loyalists, infused Sunni scholarship into a Shia court, and cultivated respect from the people by maintaining order and humility. When the last Fatimid caliph died in 1171, Saladin abolished the dynasty and proclaimed allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, reuniting Egypt with the Sunni world. It was a masterstroke. And with Egypt now aligned to Aleppo, the Crusader kingdoms were encircled. Nur ad-Din, still in Syria, watched with a mixture of pride and unease. Saladin was his general's nephew. Yes, but Egypt was distant, and ambition is a seed that grows fast in fertile ground. In 1174, Nur ad-Din died. The moment Saladin had waited for, perhaps unknowingly, had arrived. Nur ad-Din's death sent tremors across the Muslim world. He had no clear adult heir, only a young son. His once unified realm, Aleppo, Damascus, Homs was suddenly vulnerable to fragmentation. Rival emirs circled like vultures. For Saladin, now master of Egypt, the dilemma was both moral and strategic. Should he seize the reins of power and risk accusations of betrayal, or wait and risk the collapse of everything Nur ad-Din had built? Saladin chose the former, but with a patience that surprised his enemies. He did not ride north immediately. Instead, he solidified his hold on Egypt. He purged the Fatimid bureaucracy, fortified Cairo, and increased tax revenues. He patronized scholars, built madrasas, and married legitimacy to policy. His name was now invoked in Friday sermons not only as vizier, but as sultan. Then, one city at a time, he moved Damascus fell to him with barely a fight. The people, weary of instability, welcomed him. Aleppo resisted longer, but the tide had shifted. Saladin combined force and diplomacy, faith and law. His vision, like Nur ad-Din's, was not mere empire. It was religious unity under the Sunni banner. By the late 1170s, he controlled more territory than any ruler since the First Crusade. To the Crusaders, this was a nightmare made flesh. Gone were the days of petty squabbles and Muslim disunity. Now, a single ruler commanded Egypt, Syria, and the loyalty of much of the Sunni world. And unlike many before him, Saladin was not content to defend, he intended to reclaim. Yet he bided his time. He honored truces. He negotiated with Christian leaders. He even exchanged letters with King Baldwin IV, the so-called Leper King, a tragic figure whose reign was both courageous and doomed. Baldwin, intelligent and gallant, knew his kingdom could not withstand a united Muslim force. He tried diplomacy, reforms, alliances, but illness whittled away his body, even as Saladin's power grew. Meanwhile, cracks appeared among the Crusaders themselves. The Kingdom of Jerusalem suffered from factionalism. The nobility divided between native-born Franks and newly arrived barons seeking power. Baldwin IV's eventual successor was a child, Baldwin V, and his regency was contested. When the boy died young, chaos erupted. Into this fray stepped a man whose ambition would bring about disaster, Renaud of Châtillon. A seasoned warrior and reckless schemer, Renaud had spent years imprisoned in Aleppo. Upon release, he married into power and governed the strategic fortress of Kerak, which dominated trade routes between Egypt and Syria. Renaud broke every truce. He raided caravans even during times of peace. He threatened Mecca and Medina. He boasted of desecrating the Prophet's tomb. These provocations were not merely violations of etiquette, they were blasphemies. Saladin, ever cautious, had held back from full-scale war. Now, he declared jihad. The stage was set for confrontation not only over land or cities, but over justice, honor, and the fate of Jerusalem. It was the summer of 1187, and the heat rose over the hills of Galilee like a warning. Saladin had gathered a vast army, perhaps 30,000 strong, drawn from across his territories: Egyptians, Syrians, Kurds, Turks. His call to jihad had resonated. This was not merely conquest. This was redemption. The crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, marched to meet him. Accompanied by the infamous Renaud of Châtillon and the True Cross, believed to be a relic of Christ's crucifixion, carried into battle as a divine shield. They met at the Horns of Hattin, two basalt hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee. It was a trap. Saladin had cut off water sources. The Crusaders, parched and disoriented, stumbled into his ambush. The battle unfolded with brutal clarity. Surrounded, suffocated by smoke, and weakened by thirst, the Christian army fell apart. Archers rained death. Cavalry encircled. Fires consumed the dry grass. What had begun as a march of confidence ended in blood and dust. Renaud was captured and personally executed by Saladin. King Guy was spared, but shamed. And the True Cross, long seen as a divine guarantor, was taken. The road to Jerusalem lay open. City after city fell Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon. Only Tyre held out, saved by the leadership of Conrad of Montferrat, who rallied the defense with remarkable tenacity. Then, on October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered, but not with the butchery of 1099. Saladin, mindful of the past and the moral high ground, offered terms. Ransom payments were set. Civilians were allowed to leave. Churches were respected. The bloodbath many had feared did not come. And so, the Holy City passed from Christian hands back to Muslim rule. Europe reeled. the fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Christendom. Pope Urban III is said to have died of grief. His successor, Gregory VIII, issued a passionate call for a new crusade, the Third Crusade. This would not be led by obscure lords or fragmented nobles. This would be the Crusade of Kings. From England came Richard the Lionheart, fearless and flamboyant. From France, Philip II Augustus, calculating and cold. From the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, ancient and legendary. It was to be a grand endeavour, perhaps the last hope of reclaiming the Holy Land. But fate, as ever, had other plans. Frederick drowned in a river en route. His army disbanded. Philip and Richard quarrelled constantly. Philip returned to France early, and Richard, though a brilliant commander, was ultimately outmaneuvered. He won battles Acre, Arsuf, and earned Saladin's respect, but he could not retake Jerusalem. The city, so close, remained elusive. Instead, a treaty was brokered. Christians would be allowed safe passage for pilgrimage. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, and the dream of Christian empire in the east, once so grand, dimmed. Saladin returned to Damascus, weary but victorious. He died in 1193, not with treasures, but with barely enough money to pay for his burial. He had given it all away to soldiers, to the poor, to his people, and the crusader kingdoms, though still present, were broken, fragmented. Permanent reconquest would never again seem certain. The sword had struck, but it was the cross that endured, remembered in lament and in legend. Though the Third Crusade ended without recapturing Jerusalem, it reshaped the political geography of the Levant. Richard the Lionheart's conquests along the coast ensured that the Crusader presence in the Holy Land would endure, if in a diminished form. The Kingdom of Jerusalem now had no Jerusalem. Its capital moved to Acre. Its borders were tenuous. Its future uncertain. But memory is a powerful force. For generations, the loss of the Holy City remained a wound in the heart of Europe. Pilgrims still came, guided by safe conduct, walking past Saladin's tomb with reverence. Crusaders still dreamed of redemption, and across Europe, songs were sung of the battles fought, the kings who rode, and the glory lost. The dream was not dead. In the decades that followed, crusading spirit ebbed and surged. New campaigns were called. Some never reached the Holy Land. Others ended in catastrophe. But the legacy of Edessa, of Hattin, of Jerusalem, these events loomed large. In time, even Saladin became a figure of admiration in Europe, respected for his honor, his mercy, and his vision. His enemies remembered him not as a butcher, but as a sovereign. And yet, even amid treaties and tales, the cross and the sword remained forever entwined. Jerusalem, sacred to three faiths, would remain a symbol of division and desire, and the story, though paused, was far from over. As the 12th century drew to a close, the Crusader states still clung to a sliver of coastline. Acre, Tyre, and a few other fortresses formed the fragile remnants of a dream that had once spanned from Antioch to Jerusalem. But the truth was becoming harder to deny. The Holy Land could not be held by force alone. Pilgrimage continued, but the spirit had changed. Knights came, not for salvation, but for spoils. Mercenaries replaced martyrs. And the deep religious fervour that had driven the First Crusade gave way to political calculation and personal ambition. In Europe, the idea of crusading grew more abstract. Popes called for new campaigns, not just to Jerusalem, but against heretics in southern France, against pagan tribes in the Baltic, even against political rivals in Italy. The crusade became a tool of power, not merely a path to paradise. Still, in the east, those few outposts stood defiantly, surrounded by enemies, under constant threat, dependent on distant aid, and waiting, always waiting for the next tide of steel and faith to come from the west. The fall of Edessa had set a precedent. The fall of Jerusalem had shaken empires. And though the kings had come and gone, the struggle continued. But now, new forces stirred, not in the deserts of Syria, not in the hills of Galilee, but in the heart of Christendom itself. As we move into part 3, we will follow a crusade that never reached the Holy Land, a campaign born in piety and hijacked by politics, a journey that ended not in Jerusalem, but in Christian blood, on Christian soil. The story now turns to Constantinople and to betrayal. Even after the Treaty of Jaffa brought a tense peace between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin in 1192, the Holy Land was a bruised landscape. The Third Crusade had ended with a compromise. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were allowed access. It was, in truth, a political solution to a spiritual crisis. Saladin returned to Damascus, aged and exhausted. The relentless march, the constant battles, and the emotional toll of reconciling faith and statecraft had worn him thin. When he died in 1193, his empire did not collapse immediately, but it did fragment. His sons and brothers divided the territories he had unified under the green banner of Islam. The vision of a united Muslim front began to fade as regional interests reclaimed the foreground. The Christian states, too, were in flux. Richard never returned to the Holy Land. He was captured on his way back to England, ransomed, and spent the rest of his life battling his own nobles and his brother John. The kings of Europe returned to courtly intrigue and dynastic concerns. But the memory of Jerusalem's loss and Saladin's stunning victories haunted Europe. It was a wound not yet cauterized. Papal cries for a new crusade echoed through the cathedrals and chancelleries. The fall of Edessa had set a chain in motion, and even decades later, its shockwaves were still reshaping the Christian world. In the Levant, the crusader hold was reduced to narrow stretches along the Mediterranean. Acre became the new capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its ports bustled with trade and mercenaries, but its walls seemed increasingly more like a cage than a citadel. Crusading orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller filled the power vacuum, administering fortresses, collecting tithes, and sometimes acting more like warlords than monks. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was changing again. Though Saladin's heirs fought among themselves, a new power was rising in Central Asia, one that would eventually threaten both the Muslim and Christian worlds. But for now, the focus remained on the fractured lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. Between truces and treaties, skirmishes persisted, castles were built, sieges launched, borders drawn and redrawn. Crusading armies arrived in fits and starts, often too late or too few. Idealism gave way to pragmatism. Yet for every knight who came seeking heaven, there were 10 mercenaries who came seeking gold. Europe was changing too. Feudal loyalties were giving way to centralized monarchies. Urban life and trade were reviving. New cathedrals rose across France and Germany. Universities were founded. The intellectual revival of the 12th century was in full swing. But this growth also brought tensions between kings and popes, between nobility and burghers, between orthodoxy and heresy. And within this shifting landscape, the idea of the crusade began to evolve. No longer just a journey to the Holy Land, it became a flexible instrument. A crusade could be called against heretics in southern France, against pagan Slavs in the Baltic, against political enemies of the Pope. The lines between sacred mission and secular ambition blurred, but the Holy Land remained the heart of the crusading dream. And though the tides had turned, and the great kings had come and gone, the vision of Jerusalem glorious, contested, sacred still burned in the imagination of Christendom. As the embers of the Third Crusade cooled, what remained was not unity, but a deepening complexity in the Christian East. The balance of power shifted again, no longer centered on kings and nobles alone, but now increasingly in the hands of crusading orders, merchants, and financiers. In the port cities of the Levant, commerce had become inseparable from crusading. Venetian and Genoese ships delivered both pilgrims and mercenaries. These republics saw crusades not just as religious imperatives but as opportunities for monopolies, land, and profit. They negotiated terms not with bishops, but with generals. Their gold funded sieges and bought influence in Jerusalem, Acre, and Tyre. By the end of the 12th century, the Crusader states looked less like missionary outposts and more like colonial principalities. They were ruled by Latin lords, policed by knightly orders, and sustained by foreign trade. Local Christians, Armenians, Syrians, and Greeks lived uneasily under Latin rule. Muslims endured curfews, taxes, and forced conversions. Jews were marginalized, often accused of collusion or blasphemy. Yet despite this fragile hegemony, Latin Christendom felt no closer to reclaiming Jerusalem. If anything, the reverse seemed true. Saladin's successors, though disunited, retained control of the Holy City, and while some European nobles still traveled east, fewer returned. The sheer distance, the danger, and the diminishing prestige of crusading dulled its appeal. Only papal pressure and spiritual promises kept the idea alive. And so it was that Pope Innocent III, elected in 1198, stepped into this waning flame with a torch of ambition. Innocent was a new kind of pontiff intellectual, commanding, tireless. He believed the Pope stood not beneath kings, but above them. To him, the crusade was not a diplomatic errand, but a divine command. He called for a fourth crusade, with a bold goal not just to rescue Jerusalem, but to cleanse the East of all corruption, Muslim or otherwise. But no kings answered his call. Richard was dead. Philip of France and John of England were embroiled in civil war. The Holy Roman Emperor was at odds with the papacy. So instead, lesser nobles, landless knights, ambitious second sons, men with debts and dreams took up the cross. Their numbers were smaller, their resources meager. To reach the Holy Land, they needed ships, and for ships, they needed Venice. Here, the story of crusading would take a dramatic, irreversible turn. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, was nearly blind, in his 90s, but sharp as ever. He offered the Crusaders a fleet, but at a cost. When they could not pay, he proposed an alternative sack, the Christian city of Zara, a rebellious Venetian possession. Desperate and divided, the Crusaders agreed. They attacked Zara, a Christian city. During a crusade, Pope Innocent excommunicated them, but the momentum was already beyond his grasp. And then came an envoy from Constantinople. A young prince, Alexios Angelos, promised the Crusaders money, ships, and men if they helped him reclaim his throne recently stolen by his uncle. The Crusaders saw a shortcut to salvation. Dandolo saw profit. And so, the armies that were supposed to march on Jerusalem turned north, toward the greatest city in Christendom. In 1204, they reached Constantinople. The walls were high, the people wary, but Alexios was crowned. Promises were made, delays ensued, tensions rose. When funds fell short, accusations flew, then fire. The sack of Constantinople was not a battle, it was a catastrophe. Churches were looted, relics stolen, altars desecrated, nuns raped, icons smashed. Latin soldiers paraded through Hagia Sophia with stolen chalices and drunken song. It was the most devastating blow to Christian unity since the East-West Schism of 1054. The Fourth Crusade, intended to rescue Jerusalem, had instead destroyed the greatest Christian city in the East. The Byzantine Empire splintered. Latin states were carved from its corpse, and the dream of a united Christendom died among the ashes of Constantinople. Back in Europe, the news shocked even the most hardened cynics. The Pope, though initially furious, later absolved the Crusaders and accepted the loot. Practicality triumphed over principle, and the idea of crusade, once rooted in holy pilgrimage, was now irreversibly entangled with politics, profit, and power. Yet still, in the hearts of many, Jerusalem called. The next generation would try again. But something had changed. The sword of the cross no longer pointed outward alone. Sometimes it turned inward. Even after the flames of Constantinople dimmed, the reverberations of the Fourth Crusade thundered across Christendom. News of the sack reached Rome cloaked in shame. The Pope's excommunication had meant little to crusaders more loyal to contracts than crosses. The Eastern Orthodox world, already wounded by theological division, now bled from the wound of betrayal. Trust between East and West, once threadbare, now lay in tatters. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared, but it was a fragile, hollow echo of the city it claimed. Latin lords installed themselves in Byzantine palaces, but they lacked legitimacy, understanding, or cohesion. The Venetians took the lion's share literally and figuratively, carving out commercial privileges and relics that would adorn their churches and squares for centuries. St. Mark's Basilica glittered with stolen icons, each a monument to opportunism cloaked in piety. Back in Western Europe, crusading zeal faltered. The idea that crusades could be redirected not against infidels, but fellow Christians cast a long, unsettling shadow. Critics began to murmur, was this truly God's will or man's greed dressed in sanctimony? But in times of confusion, people still turned to symbols, and no symbol burned brighter than Jerusalem. It remained under Muslim control, a constant reminder of what had not been achieved. The Fifth Crusade was launched with hopes of learning from past mistakes, and yet it too would falter not through lack of faith, but through the very human flaws of ambition, miscommunication, and poor planning. The Crusaders attacked Egypt, hoping to trade Cairo for Jerusalem. At first, victory seemed possible. They captured Damietta, but pride overruled patience. When the Nile flooded and logistics crumbled, the army found itself trapped, forced to surrender. The crusade ended not with a triumph, but a trudge through humiliation. Among the ashes, new voices arose, ones no longer content with militarism alone. In the 13th century, St. Francis of Assisi famously traveled to Egypt to speak with Sultan Al-Kamil, not with sword, but with open hands. He preached peace, attempting what armies could not. Though unsuccessful in converting the Sultan, his journey marked a pivotal moment, a whisper that perhaps faith did not always require force. Still, the papacy pressed on. Innocent III's successors, Gregory IX, Innocent IV continued to preach the crusade as a sacred obligation. Indulgences were offered like coinage. Bishops thundered from pulpits. The cross remained both a promise and a burden, but the audience was changing. Fewer nobles signed up. Monarchs grew wary. The glory of Jerusalem had dulled beneath layers of disappointment. What had once been a movement of unity now splintered into regional ambitions and papal manipulation. In this crucible of fatigue, the crusade began to turn inward, not just toward Constantinople, but toward heretics, toward dissent, toward anyone who challenged Rome's authority. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France, though launched earlier, became a template, a crusade against fellow Christians. Cathars deemed heretics were massacred, towns burned, entire regions brought under closer papal control. It was a crusade in rhetoric, but an expansion of political power in truth. By the late 1200s, the very meaning of crusade had become elastic. It stretched to include campaigns in the Baltic, against pagans, wars in Spain, against Muslims, campaigns within Europe itself. The original call to reclaim the Holy Land was still preached, but less believed. And yet, amid this spiritual dissonance, the Crusader states clung on. Barely. Acre, Tyre, and a few scattered fortresses remained. Pilgrims still visited, though their journeys were increasingly dangerous. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights became both defenders and de facto rulers. Their castles dotted the coastline. Their treasuries grew. Their influence rivaled kings. But they could not hold back time. In 1291, Acre fell. The last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant crumbled after a brutal siege. The defenders fought bravely, but the numbers were overwhelming. Smoke and screams filled the port. Those who could fled by sea. Those who remained were killed or enslaved. The loss of Acre marked the end of the Latin East. There would be other crusades, other calls to arms, but the dream, the great unifying mission of Christendom, was over. Jerusalem remained distant. Constantinople scarred. Europe, once eager to fight in foreign deserts, now looked inward, troubled by its own storms. But though the sword of the cross had lost its edge in the Levant, its shadow would linger for centuries, in politics, in art, in faith, and in memory. Yet even as the ashes cooled in Acre, the impact of the Crusades reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The economic networks forged by crusading trade routes, maritime ports, coinage systems remained alive. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, grew wealthy from Crusader traffic. Spices, silks, and ideas continued to flow, if not along the routes of conquest, then along the lanes of commerce. The Crusades had unintentionally opened Europe to the East in ways no sword alone could accomplish. But it was not just goods that moved, so too did memories. Legends of heroism, of martyrdom, of betrayal, entered folklore and literature. The chansons de geste sang of noble knights and pious kings. Monks copied chronicles by candlelight, preserving both fact and embellishment. The Crusader was canonized in the imagination, even as real crusading waned. In Muslim lands, the memory of the Crusades was more immediate, more bitter. Though Saladin was admired in both Christian and Islamic sources for his chivalry, the scars of invasion left lasting tensions. The destruction, the cultural misunderstandings, the massacres these lived on in stories passed down from generation to generation. In the Byzantine East, the memory of the Latin betrayal at Constantinople never faded. The schism between Catholic and Orthodox, once theological, had been deepened by blood. The Franks, as they called Westerners, were no longer just foreigners, they were destroyers. And within Europe itself, the Crusades left a contradictory legacy. The glory and piety of the early campaigns were tarnished by greed, division, and internal crusades. As faith turned to fanaticism, many began to question the very premise of holy war. By the 14th century, the spiritual winds were shifting. Plague and famine would soon darken Europe's skies. The 100 Years' War was on the horizon. Papal authority wavered. And though the idea of crusade would never truly disappear, it would evolve, recast in the politics and propaganda of new ages. But for now, as the last knights departed the Holy Land and the towers of Acre crumbled into history, an era came to a close. The cross had not reclaimed Jerusalem. The sword had not secured salvation. But in their collision, faith and war, something enduring had been forged, a legacy of devotion and destruction, memory and myth that would echo across continents and centuries. They marched under the cross, sworn to reclaim Jerusalem, but their swords would never reach its gates. Instead, they would turn against fellow Christians, against marble columns, mosaicked domes, and ancient relics that had stood for 1,000 years. This is the story of the crusade that betrayed its purpose and changed Christendom forever. The year was 1202. Pope Innocent III, young and ambitious, called for a new crusade. His aim was clear: recapture Jerusalem. Yet Europe, still weary from past failures, responded slowly. The great kings Philip of France, Richard of England were gone or occupied. This time, the crusading banner was taken up by lesser nobles, mostly from France and northern Italy. They were pious, yes, but also poor, and dangerously dependent on those who could provide ships, supplies, and passage. Enter Venice, the most serene republic, as it called itself, had built a maritime empire through cunning and commerce. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, old, blind, but fiercely shrewd, agreed to transport the Crusader army across the sea for a price. But when the Crusaders failed to pay, the Doge offered an alternative. If they helped him attack the Christian city of Zara, technically, under Hungarian protection, their debt would be forgiven. It was a deal made in shadows. A crusading army, sworn to defend Christendom, now turned its weapons on fellow Christians. Zara fell in blood and smoke, and even as Pope Innocent excommunicated the entire force for their betrayal, the Crusaders pressed on, rationalizing that the ends justified the means. But darker turns awaited. While wintering in Zara, the Crusaders were approached by a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos. His father, the former emperor, had been deposed. Alexios promised gold, men, and submission to Rome if the Crusaders helped him reclaim the Byzantine throne. It was a promise too tempting to refuse. And so, in the spring of 1203, the Crusaders set sail not for the Holy Land, but for Constantinople. As the towers of Constantinople rose on the horizon, the Crusaders beheld a city unlike any they had ever seen. Its golden domes shimmered under the sun. Its mighty walls stood proud, defiant. It was the heart of Orthodox Christianity, the New Rome, older and richer than anything in the Latin West. And they came not as pilgrims, but as invaders. In July 1203, the Crusaders launched their assault. The city's defenders, surprised and fragmented, could not repel the full fury of the attack. By August, Emperor Alexios III fled, and the Crusaders installed young Alexios IV as co-emperor, alongside his restored father. But promises made in exile are hard to keep. Alexios IV struggled to raise the funds he had pledged. The Byzantine treasury was empty, the nobility resentful, and the citizens of Constantinople furious at the Latin interlopers who roamed their streets like conquerors. Tensions escalated, fights broke out, churches were desecrated. The fragile alliance began to crack. In early 1204, the people of Constantinople rose in rebellion. Alexios IV was murdered. A new emperor, Alexios V, refused to honor the Crusaders' demands, so they turned again to war. On April 12, 1204, the Latin army breached the city's defenses. What followed was not a battle. It was a cataclysm. For 3 days, Constantinople was subjected to fire, theft, and desecration. Soldiers looted churches, defiled altars, and carted off relics that had survived for centuries. The bronze horses of the hippodrome were hauled to Venice. The sacred relics of saints and apostles vanished into Western cathedrals. It was not a crusade. It was a conquest. Pope Innocent, horrified by the news, condemned the sack, but by then, the damage was done. The Byzantine Empire shattered into fragments. A Latin empire was established in its place, ruled by crusader lords who had come to liberate Jerusalem, but crowned themselves in Constantinople instead. As the towers of Constantinople rose on the horizon, the Crusaders beheld a city unlike any they had ever seen. Its golden domes shimmered under the sun. Its mighty walls stood proud, defiant. It was the heart of Orthodox Christianity, the New Rome, older and richer than anything in the Latin West. And they came not as pilgrims, but as invaders. In July 1203, the Crusaders launched their assault. The city's defenders, surprised and fragmented, could not repel the full fury of the attack. By August, Emperor Alexios III fled, and the Crusaders installed young Alexios IV as co-emperor, alongside his restored father. But promises made in exile are hard to keep. Alexios IV struggled to raise the funds he had pledged. The Byzantine treasury was empty, the nobility resentful, and the citizens of Constantinople furious at the Latin interlopers who roamed their streets like conquerors. Tensions escalated. Fights broke out. Churches were desecrated. The fragile alliance began to crack. In early 1204, the people of Constantinople rose in rebellion. Alexios IV was murdered. A new emperor, Alexios V, refused to honor the Crusaders' demands. So they turned again to war. On April 12, 1204, the Latin army breached the city's defenses. What followed was not a battle, it was a cataclysm. For 3 days, Constantinople was subjected to fire, theft, and desecration. Soldiers looted churches, defiled altars, and carted off relics that had survived for centuries. The bronze horses of the hippodrome were hauled to Venice. The sacred relics of saints and apostles vanished into Western cathedrals. It was not a crusade, it was a conquest. Pope Innocent, horrified by the news, condemned the sack, but by then, the damage was done. The Byzantine Empire shattered into fragments. A Latin empire was established in its place, ruled by crusader lords who had come to liberate Jerusalem but crowned themselves in Constantinople instead. In the years that followed the sack of Constantinople, the crusader states in the east began to weaken. The so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople, though crowned in splendor, was riddled with instability. It held power in name more than in strength, and it lacked both the legitimacy and the resources to control the vast Byzantine lands. Meanwhile, the original Byzantine elite fled to rival states, the Despotate of Epirus, the Empire of Nicaea, and the Empire of Trebizond, each claiming to be the true heir to Constantinople. These splinter realms would continue to fight, not only against the Latins, but also among themselves, desperate to reclaim the imperial throne. The divisions sown by the Crusaders proved fatal in the long run. Orthodox Christians across the Balkans and Anatolia grew resentful of the West. Hatred simmered between the Latin and Greek churches, no longer just theological, but soaked in blood. The dream of a united Christendom, briefly imagined in the First Crusade, now lay in ashes, and the Muslim world, it watched. The sack of Constantinople did not weaken Islam, it fractured Christendom, with Jerusalem still firmly in Islamic hands, and the Crusaders distracted by political games in Europe and Byzantium. The balance of power began to shift. In Egypt, the Ayyubid dynasty consolidated its rule. In Anatolia, Turkish beyliks expanded their influence, and in the distant steppes, the Mongols gathered strength, poised to descend upon both East and West alike. By the mid-13th century, the crusading ideal had lost its purity. Papal indulgences were offered for fighting heretics in Europe, not just Muslims in the East. Crusade became a word used as much for politics as for piety. Still, Jerusalem remained out of reach, and Constantinople, once the bulwark of the East, lay in ruins, a shadow of its former glory. Its churches stripped, its treasures dispersed, its soul wounded. The crusade, meant to reclaim the Holy Land, had instead betrayed its own faith, and the price would echo through centuries of mistrust and division. What began as a holy mission ended in contradiction, a crusade not remembered for triumph, but for treachery. The Fourth Crusade, instead of bringing salvation, brought schism. Instead of lifting the cross over Jerusalem, it tore down the cross in the east. Venetian ships returned home heavy with spoils, chalices, relics, golden candelabras. The horses of St. Mark's Basilica still stand today, silent witnesses to a betrayal disguised as victory. Latin chroniclers praised their conquest as divine justice. Byzantine scribes wrote of sacrilege and sorrow. The echoes were long-lasting. Orthodox Christians, betrayed and humiliated, would never again trust their Latin brethren. The dream of reunion between East and West faded into bitterness. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, many remembered 1204 not as an isolated tragedy, but as the first wound that bled the empire dry. The Crusader states, scattered and weakened, lost their momentum. Future crusades would lack the unity and spiritual clarity of the first. The Church's authority, once ascendant, began to fracture. The seeds of Reformation, sown in disillusionment, would one day take root in the shadow of shattered faith. In the end, the sack of Constantinople was not just a military mistake. It was a moral collapse. And from the ruins, new powers would rise. But that is a story for another chapter. When the Latin Empire crumbled, it didn't fall in fire and fury, but in erosion slow, relentless, humiliating. After 1204, the Crusader hold on Constantinople lasted less than 60 years. In 1261, the Byzantines under Michael VIII Palaiologos reclaimed their capital. They returned not as triumphant heirs, but as exhausted survivors. The city they re-entered was stripped, hollowed. The empire they revived was a ghost of its former self. The Latin occupation had broken more than walls. It had shattered trust. The Eastern Church, already wary of Rome, now considered reconciliation a delusion. From pulpits in Thessaloniki to monasteries on Mount Athos, the betrayal of 1204 became holy grievance. Unity was no longer a dream, it was a wound. Meanwhile, in the Levant, the remaining Crusader strongholds, Acre, Tripoli, Tyre hung on precariously. They were no longer frontier bastions of Christendom, but isolated enclaves under constant siege. Each year brought fewer reinforcements. Each victory by Muslim armies pushed them closer to the sea. In Egypt and Syria, the Mamluks had risen a warrior caste turned dynasty. Fiercely disciplined, politically astute, they replaced the fading Ayyubids. Under sultans like Baybars and Qalawun, the Mamluks became the scourge of the Crusader states. They didn't just resist, they erased. One by one, the cities that had been captured in the First Crusade were retaken. Antioch in 1268, Tripoli in 1289, and then Acre. In 1291, the last major Crusader city fell. The siege was brutal, the resistance desperate. When the Mamluks breached the walls, they showed no mercy. Crusaders were slaughtered, captives sold, churches razed. The Mediterranean echoed with the cries of defeat. Christendom was stunned. The Holy Land, the object of 2 centuries of faith and fury, was lost. No Crusader banner flew over Jerusalem. No Latin prince ruled beyond the sea. The age of crusades was over, or so it seemed. But crusading, as an idea, refused to die. Though the Levant was lost, Europe's appetite for holy war found new outlets. In Iberia, Christian kingdoms pushed steadily southward, reclaiming territory from Muslim rulers. This reconquista, once peripheral, became central. Crusading indulgences, those spiritual rewards originally reserved for journeys to Jerusalem, were now granted to soldiers in Spain and Portugal. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights turned their swords eastward. Pagan tribes, Lithuanians, Prussians, and others became the new infidels. Castles rose where forests once stood. Conversion came at sword point, cloaked in Latin liturgy and iron discipline. Even within Europe, the language of crusade persisted. The papacy, seeking to protect its influence, declared internal crusades against heretics. The Albigensian Crusade, launched against the Cathars in southern France, was as brutal as any fort in the Levant. Whole towns were razed. Faith was tested not abroad, but at home. Yet the grandeur of earlier crusades never returned. There were no new Jerusalems, no new Baldwins or Bohemons, only opportunists, kings with debts, knights without land. The zeal of the First Crusade gave way to cynicism, corruption, and confusion. Meanwhile, Islamic powers grew stronger and more unified. The Mamluks held Egypt. The Ottomans expanded from Anatolia into Europe itself. In 1453, they achieved what Crusaders never had. They conquered Constantinople. The fall of the city, once the greatest bastion of Christianity in the East, sent shockwaves through Europe. But there was no great crusade in response. The world had changed. Trade now shaped power more than pilgrimage. Gunpowder spoke louder than relics. Faith, while still fervent, faced new questions of reform, of reason, of exploration. But the legacy of the Crusades endured. In the cracked foundations of ruined fortresses, in the shared legends of East and West, in the deep distrust between Christian and Muslim worlds, in the art that glorified knights, and in the scars that lingered behind monastery walls. The Crusades had reshaped Europe, not just its borders, but its beliefs. And in that reshaping, the medieval dream of a united Christendom gave way to something messier, more modern. Not the end of faith, but the end of certainty. As the 14th century progressed, the Crusades faded into memory, but their consequences haunted Europe's politics, religion, and imagination. Kings no longer rallied tens of thousands to sail eastward, but they invoked the Crusader past in their claims of legitimacy, conquest, and divine favor. The iconography of the Red Cross, of the noble knight on horseback, endured in heraldry, in poetry, and in the self-image of Christendom. In literature, the Crusades became myth. Troubadours sang of heroism and heartbreak. Chroniclers spun tales of glory and betrayal, often glossing over the complex realities in favor of simplified morality tales. Saladin, once a feared enemy, was transformed in some Christian accounts into a chivalrous nobleman, a sanitized rival, who fit better into evolving notions of knighthood than the barbaric caricatures once portrayed. Yet for the people of the Middle East, the memory was different. The Crusaders were not romantic figures, but invaders. Their fortresses, left behind in ruin, became symbols of foreign incursion. The term frange remained, associated with violence and arrogance. The blood spilled during sieges of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Acre remained in communal memory, not just as historical footnotes, but as stories of endurance and resistance. This divergence in memory would carry forward for centuries. In Europe, the Crusades were increasingly viewed through a nostalgic lens, part of a lost age of valor. In the Islamic world, they were reminders of Western aggression, of cultural and religious conflict that left deep scars. Ironically, even as Europe forgot the true horrors of the Crusades, it continued to shape its identity around them. During the Protestant Reformation, reformers accused the Catholic Church of having lost the true crusading spirit, of becoming decadent and corrupt. Meanwhile, the Catholic Counter-Reformation sought to reclaim that image, casting new missions and conquests as spiritual warfare. And then came the age of exploration. European powers, now equipped with ships, gunpowder, and a renewed hunger for empire, carried the rhetoric of crusade into the New World. Indigenous peoples became the new pagans. Conversion by sword returned not in Jerusalem, but in Mexico, in Peru, in the Philippines. The sword of the Crusader had changed shape, but it had not been sheathed. While the military campaigns dwindled, the ideological weight of the Crusades persisted in the very structures of European thought. Pilgrimages, which once overlapped with crusading fervor, continued to flourish, no longer tied to conquest, but still laced with the aura of sanctified journey. Cities like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome drew thousands who sought forgiveness, healing, or meaning in a world increasingly fractured. Academically, universities preserved the arguments and theological justifications that once sanctioned holy war. Canon law, shaped by the rhetoric of popes like Urban II and Innocent III, remained etched in parchment and principle. The idea that violence could be sanctified, that killing might be an act of piety, did not fade easily. It echoed into the politics of kings, the sermons of priests, and the policies of empires. One of the most persistent legacies of the Crusades lay in the deepening rift between Christian denominations. The schism between Latin Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, long in the making, was irrevocably sealed by the sack of Constantinople. Trust between Rome and Byzantium shattered not only through theology, but through blood and betrayal. Even as attempts at reunion were made, they rang hollow. The wounds of 1204 lingered longer than most could admit. In the Middle East, Mamluk and Ottoman rulers reshaped the geography left behind. Crusader castles were repurposed or dismantled, Latin churches converted or abandoned. The coastal cities of the Levant shifted into new roles, no longer footholds for Western pilgrims, but vital ports in Islamic trade and administration. And yet, the ghosts remained. Travellers from the West still marvelled at the remnants of Acre, of Crac des Chevaliers, of Jerusalem's once Latin chapels. They wondered how such stone could be moved, such walls raised. To them, these were monuments not to faith, but to a kind of madness. The madness of believing that one could take heaven by storm, that salvation could be won through siege engines and steel. But some remembered differently. In the monasteries of Europe, where monks copied manuscripts and whispered matins, the Crusades became moral tales, warnings and aspirations alike. Saints were made of martyrs. Heretics were equated with Saracens. And in quiet corners, some began to question whether it had all been worth it. Not just the cost in lives, but the cost in soul. In the countryside, the Crusades left subtler marks, songs of knights who never returned, relics brought home from distant cathedrals, and graves marked with symbols of faraway battles. Generations grew up hearing tales of grand journeys that ended in silence. Some families honoured ancestors who had fought for the cross. Others never spoke of them again. Even the language bore scars. Words like crusader entered common use, stripped from context, bent into metaphor. To be a crusader meant to be righteous, determined, zealous. Rarely did it mean bloody, divisive, or tragic, though all those things lingered in its shadow. In visual art, the legacy shifted with the centuries. Renaissance painters, fascinated by classical antiquity, often ignored the Crusades altogether, choosing to bathe in Roman robes rather than chainmail. But Baroque drama rediscovered the holy wars, casting them in operas and sculptures as theatre. Pain, sacrifice, and glory sanitized, aestheticized, but never forgotten. As the Enlightenment dawned, thinkers turned critical eyes to the past. Philosophers like Voltaire and Gibbon saw the Crusades as folly evidence of superstition and religious zeal gone awry. The age of reason scoffed at the age of holy war. But even in critique, the fascination endured. And so, the Crusades entered modernity not as a closed chapter, but as an open question. What do we remember and why? Do we see brave knights or invading hordes? Do we hear hymns or screams? Does the red cross on white silk still stand for something sacred or something lost? These are the legacies of faith and failure, and they do not end with the Middle Ages. By the end of the 13th century, with Acre fallen and the last Crusader strongholds lost to the Mamluks, Europe was left staring at the horizon, not just across the Mediterranean, but into itself. What began as a righteous pilgrimage had unraveled into centuries of war, massacre, and unfulfilled promises. The Christian kingdoms that had once flourished briefly in the Levant were gone. In their place stood Islamic sultanates more unified and organized than when the Crusaders had arrived. The effort to take and hold the Holy Land had failed not simply militarily, but ideologically. The dream of Christendom triumphant had eroded under the weight of reality. Yet, the crusading spirit didn't vanish, it simply changed costume. Popes continued to declare crusades, but now against heretics within Europe, the Cathars, the Hussites, and even rebellious kings. The sword of the cross turned inward, cleaving Christian from Christian, sinner from Orthodox. In Spain, it morphed into the Reconquista, more successful militarily, but equally tied to religious identity and exclusion. And in every war that followed, whether against Ottomans, pagans, or reformers, the shadow of the Crusades loomed. Rhetoric endured, songs endured, and most powerfully, the idea endured that faith could justify force, that belief could sanctify conquest. Some learned new lessons from the failure in the East: more tolerance, deeper diplomacy, a cautious recognition of religious plurality. But many did not. Instead, they crafted narratives of betrayal and martyrdom, laying blame on anyone but themselves: greedy Venetians, cowardly Byzantines, perfidious Jews, secret Muslims. The scapegoats shifted, but the instinct remained. Meanwhile, the Holy Land itself, long contested, was reshaped not by theology but by trade, law, and empire. Its sacred stones were walked by pilgrims from many creeds. Its churches, mosques, and synagogues stood side by side, not always peacefully, but persistently. The memory of the Crusaders faded under newer struggles and stories. Europe, in its own time, moved on. But the Crusades had left a mark that could not be fully erased. They had built no lasting kingdom, but they had built a legacy. In the centuries that followed the Crusades, their consequences rippled outward through Europe and the Middle East alike. The wounds were not just political, they were spiritual and psychological, embedded in memory, culture, and identity. And these wounds, in some ways, never fully healed. For Christian Europe, the Crusades became both a source of pride and an uneasy ghost. In some quarters, they were remembered as bold ventures for faith, a romanticized age when the sword served God, and sin was met on the battlefield. In others, they were seen with shame, a long testament to misplaced zealotry, cruelty, and greed. The dichotomy never resolved. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the Crusades entered history not just as military invasions, but as symbols of betrayal and foreign incursion. The memory of Saladin, who retook Jerusalem not with slaughter, but with strategy and clemency, became a cornerstone of Islamic historiography, a reminder of dignity in the face of devastation. But not all foes were so merciful. In both East and West, the religious implications of the Crusades sowed seeds of distrust. The Christian-Muslim divide, once navigated through diplomacy and coexistence in cities like Cordoba or Cairo, was hardened by blood. The Latin Orthodox schism deepened after the sack of Constantinople, and Jews across Europe remembered not the glories of the Crusader age, but the pogroms that accompanied its every campaign. Back in Europe, the political consequences evolved rapidly. Monarchs, once beholden to papal calls to crusade, began asserting their own authority over spiritual affairs. The centralized power of kings grew thanks in part to the administrative and military innovations developed during the Crusades. Taxes levied for campaigns, supply chains forged across borders, alliances negotiated on the strength of letters and coin all became models for statecraft. And so, the Crusades ended, but they never truly disappeared. They became framework and metaphor. And in the echo chamber of European history, they returned again and again, even after the last Crusader stronghold had fallen. The mythos of the Crusades remained embedded in European consciousness. The songs of chivalric valor, the vivid tales of holy war, the martyrdoms and miracles, these became the fodder of troubadours and chroniclers for centuries. Children learned of Jerusalem as both a lost dream and a moral battleground. The spiritual narrative of divine warfare became part of the medieval DNA. Literature transformed the memory. The chansons de geste, Arthurian epics, And later, romances folded crusader themes into their structures. Knights no longer fought just Saracens, they fought dragons, temptation, doubt. The battlefield became allegorical. The Holy Land, a cipher for purity, sin, redemption. And while art sanctified the warrior, the church grew more cautious. The catastrophic failures and violent schisms left scars on ecclesiastical authority. Some clergy argued the Crusades had been necessary, others that they had been misguided ventures led by pride. Councils debated theology, reformers whispered of change. Seeds that would eventually bloom in Reformation and Revolution were quietly planted. Yet for many, the memory of the Crusades offered something simpler belonging, a sense of shared mission, however tragic, a unifying myth in a fragmented world. Knights Templar and Hospitaller relics remained objects of fascination. Crusader graves were venerated. Even as Renaissance light began to dawn, the shadow of the Crusader cross lingered. And it is here, perhaps, that the legacy is most haunting in how easily the rhetoric of holy war could be repurposed. For conquest, for colonization, for empire. The template had been set an other to fight, a faith to claim, a cause to justify. Later wars, far from Jerusalem, still borrowed the language of salvation and sacrifice. The Holy Land, meanwhile, remained holy, but to whom was always the question, and whose blood would answer, always the price. And then came the empires. As Europe entered the age of exploration, kings and queens dispatched ships with banners bearing the cross not to reclaim Jerusalem, but to conquer new lands. Yet the echoes of the Crusades were unmistakable. The rhetoric of Christian mission, of divine right, of holy endeavor, all carried forward reshaped into justification for colonization. In Spain and Portugal, conquistadors invoked God as they crossed oceans. In England and France, the notion of civilizing the heathen bore eerie resemblance to earlier calls to arms against the Muslim world. Missionary zeal combined with mercantile ambition, cloaking sword and treaty alike in divine purpose. Crusading, it seemed, had merely changed form. The legacy found new battlegrounds not in Palestine, but in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And in these expansions, the memory of the medieval Crusades sanitized, romanticized, helped shape the moral framework of empire. This was not seen as conquest. This was seen as salvation. Yet even at home, Europe remained entangled in its Crusader past. Secret societies like the Freemasons borrowed Templar lore. 19th century romantics resurrected Crusader imagery in opera, painting, and architecture. Churches were built in Gothic style, statues of armored knights adorned public squares, and poets dreamed of lost causes and sacred quests. By the time of the World Wars, the language of the Crusade had re-entered politics in full. Leaders spoke of righteous war, of liberating sacred spaces, of defending civilization against barbarism. In propaganda posters and military speeches, medieval metaphors marched again. And today, the word crusade still carries weight, powerful, polarizing, potent. For some, it evokes courage, mission, and conviction. For others, it means arrogance, bloodshed, and cultural violence. Its legacy is not fixed. It is contested, reframed, re-argued in classrooms, films, and political chambers. And perhaps that is the true legacy, not the cities taken or lost, the kings crowned or slain, but the memory that refuses to rest. A memory that demands we ask, how do we tell stories of faith and war without glorifying one or justifying the other? How do we remember the Crusades not as fantasy, not as folly, but as the raw, contradictory, human thing they were, in the East too? The scars endured. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187, the sack of Constantinople in 1204, These were not just historical wounds, but recurring symbols of betrayal and trauma. Islamic chroniclers recorded the brutality of the Crusaders with bitter clarity. The memory of foreign knights invading sacred lands lived on in sermons, epics, and oral histories. Saladin became more than a sultan. He became a legend. His reputation, revived centuries later by nationalists and scholars, came to embody a Muslim ideal of chivalry, wisdom, and righteous resistance. In contrast, the Crusaders were remembered not as noble foes, but as arrogant invaders, men who killed women and children, defiled mosques, and called it holy. This polarization hardened over time. As colonial empires expanded, the memory of the Crusades was revived again, this time in resistance. In the 20th century, Arab thinkers, revolutionaries, and leaders referenced the Crusades to frame their own struggles against European powers. The cross and the crescent ancient symbols were summoned anew in the language of protest and pride. Even in diplomacy, the past refused silence. In 1996, Osama bin Laden invoked the Crusades to justify terror. Western intervention in the Middle East was framed not as geopolitics, but as a continuation of medieval war. The term crusader became code for imperialist, occupier, infidel. And so, the Crusades, though distant, remained present. Museums now try to tell fuller stories. Universities teach nuance. Documentaries attempt balance. Yet in popular culture, the Crusades are still battlegrounds. Films romanticize or demonize. Games turn holy war into entertainment. Political speeches twist history for applause. The legacy is messy because the history was messy. But confronting that mess is essential. It teaches us that holy war rarely ends at the walls of a city. That faith, when wielded as weapon, leaves wounds not easily healed. That stories, if told without care, become fuel for future fires. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that remembering must not become repeating. The Crusades did not end with a treaty or a truce. They did not fade quietly into the dust of forgotten wars. Instead, they lingered reimagined, rewritten, repurposed through the centuries that followed. They became more than history. They became myth. In the West, the Crusades passed into legend, not just in church annals or royal chronicles, but in the hearts of nations forging identity. The knight in shining armor, the holy quest, the noble war for God. These tropes found new homes in the literature of empire, the propaganda of politics, and the dreams of power. By the 19th century, medieval revivalism swept through Europe. Architects built neo-Gothic cathedrals. Poets and novelists resurrected Crusader heroes. Painters imagined epic battles between Christendom and Islam. And in the shadow of this aesthetic romance, colonial expansion wrapped itself in Crusader language once again. In schools, history books told a story of heroism, the brutal sieges, the massacres, the betrayals. These were footnotes. Instead, children learned of chivalry, honor, and destiny. Crusaders were cast as pioneers, defenders of civilization, harbingers of Europe's rise. But in the Islamic world, the narrative was not so romantic. Here, the Crusades were remembered not as noble quests, but as foreign invasions. The sack of Jerusalem, the desecration of the Dome of the Rock, the slaughter of civilians, these were seared into memory. The Crusader was not a hero, he was the enemy. And this memory, too, passed from generation to generation, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, always waiting. In the modern era, these parallel memories collided. In the 20th century, as Western powers drew new borders across the Middle East, built empires, toppled regimes, and claimed resources, old wounds reopened. The cross returned, not on banners, but on helmets. And those who resisted saw history not as past, but as prologue. Terrorist leaders invoked the Crusades in fiery rhetoric. Propaganda videos dubbed American soldiers crusaders. Monuments bombed. Civilians killed, all in the name of avenging centuries-old sins. History was weaponized. Again. And in the West, a new narrative emerged in response. Crusades were cast not only as history, but as warnings. Scholars began to re-examine motives, expose myths, challenge heroism, the complexity of the Crusades, the greed, the zeal. The human cost was finally brought to light. Museums reframed exhibitions, textbooks were rewritten. Films like Kingdom of Heaven tried, however imperfectly, to explore the grey spaces. The conversation shifted from celebration to contemplation. And yet, myth still lingers. Politicians still use crusade to inspire or provoke. Extremists still use history to justify violence. Pop culture still simplifies. And beneath it all, the ancient tension between cross and crescent, east and west, belief and power, simmers. So what do we do with this legacy? We remember it not as fantasy, not as fable, but as reality. Messy, painful, human. We teach it not as a clash of civilizations, but as a collision of choices. Some brave, some cruel, all real. We confront it not with shame or pride, but with truth, because only in truth is there healing. And we carry forward not with sword or sermon, but with questions about faith, about justice, about what we build when we claim to act for something greater than ourselves. The Crusades are over, but the echoes remain in the stones of Jerusalem, in the books on our shelves, in the words we choose, and in the peace we try, still, to forge. It's in the silence of ancient cathedrals and the call to prayer echoing across old walls that we feel it a memory too loud to vanish, too deep to ignore. The Crusades are not just history, they are inheritance. And like all inheritances, they carry both value and burden. This inheritance shaped the world. It defined borders. Jerusalem, still divided by faith. Antioch, a shadow of its former self. Acre, now a coastal town, its fortresses lapped by Mediterranean waves. These are no longer the battlegrounds of crusaders, but they are haunted by them. It shaped ideology. Western ideas of just war, martyrdom, civilizational superiority, many trace their lineage to crusading theology. The idea that war could be holy, that violence could purify, that conquest could redeem these have long shadows. It shaped imagination. Fantasy literature is soaked in crusader imagery nights, quests, divine artifacts. Even modern superheroes echo their fervor: righteous violence, sacred mission, world-saving cause. The archetype endures, and it shaped prejudice. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism found fertile soil in crusader rhetoric. The other was not just different, but damned. This thinking, once pulpits and pamphlets, is now posts and platforms. The language changed, the fear did not, but history, effaced, can heal. Today, scholars work across divides: Christian, Muslim, Jewish. Secular researchers piece together truths from chronicles and bones, letters and ruins. Dialogue replaces dogma. Complexity replaces caricature. And in classrooms from Oxford to Cairo, young minds ask better questions. Tourists walk through Jerusalem, Florence, Istanbul, not as conquerors, but as learners. Some seek beauty, others, answers. All tread paths laid by warriors and pilgrims long gone. Artifacts once looted are repatriated. Churches once closed are reopened. Names once vilified are reconsidered. The work is slow, but it is work worth doing. Because if the Crusades taught us anything, it is this belief, untethered from empathy, burns. But belief, rooted in humility, builds. The age of crusades has ended, but the age of consequence continues. And in this age, we are the crusaders of memory. Not with swords, but with stories, with curiosity, with courage, with care. Across Europe, some churches still ring bells once dedicated to crusade calls. In Spain, ancient banners from the Reconquista hang next to modern EU flags. In Syria and Lebanon, children learn of castles that once bore strange flags. Time moved forward, but stone and memory linger. Hollywood has not helped. Films like Kingdom of Heaven paint dramatic, often distorted visions. Brave knights, noble Saracens, simplified sagas, stripped of contradiction. Entertainment, yes. Education, not always. Yet art has always mythologized war. Even during the Crusades, troubadours composed songs of valor, while poets in Damascus wrote laments. History was always part story, part shield. What matters is how we hold it now. And so the question remains, what do we do with this legacy? One answer lies in empathy. Imagine a crusader not as a hero or villain, but as a frightened pilgrim, taught that Jerusalem's soil held his soul's salvation. Imagine a Saracen defender, not as foe, but as a father, seeing his home threatened. These were people flawed, devout, desperate. Another answer lies in context. The Crusades were not a singular act of aggression. They were a series of events, some political, some spiritual, some opportunistic. They were shaped by their time, not ours. To judge them is not to excuse them, but to understand them fully. And a final answer lies in voice. For too long, Crusade history was told from the West, but now, voices rise from the East, from women, from minorities, from those who lived in the margins. Their stories deepen the truth, and truth is our best chance at peace, because history never truly ends. It loops, it lingers, it warns, and in telling these stories not to glorify, but to remember we honor those who fell, those who fought, and those who simply endured. So let us end not with a battle cry, but with a whisper, may we never again kill in God's name. May we never again confuse conquest for salvation. May the cross and the crescent, the star and the sun, share not a battlefield, but a sky. Even today, the shadow of the Crusades lingers in our vocabulary. Crusade is still used to describe moral campaigns against poverty, for justice, for health, against drugs. The word, detached from its brutal origins, has become a metaphor. But for many in the East, the word still wounds. It recalls invasion, slaughter, erasure. Memory, after all, wears different clothes depending on where you stand. Museums across Europe hold relics and treasures that cross seas in the age of holy war. Some were traded, others taken by sword. Ivory boxes from Damascus, gold-threaded robes from Constantinople, fragments of the true cross, some behind glass, others buried in vaults. And now, questions arise. Who owns memory? Who gets to display the past in schools? The way the Crusades are taught is evolving. The heroism, once celebrated, is now paired with horror. Children are encouraged not to memorize dates, but to empathize with choices. Why did so many leave everything behind? What did they believe? What did they fear? The answers are not easy. That is the point. In interfaith dialogues, the Crusades are a point of pain and potential. Shared histories, however tragic, offer opportunities for reconciliation. Muslim and Christian leaders have stood together in Jerusalem, not to debate, but to grieve. The stones beneath them remember, and in their silence, unity can grow. Digital archives now bring ancient chronicles online. Arabic accounts once ignored by Western academia are being translated. Jewish memories of Crusade massacres are preserved in virtual libraries. The democratization of history is reshaping its center. The story of the Crusades is no longer one story. It is many, layered and alive. And for creators, like yourself, Telling these stories today is a form of stewardship. You don't just recount the past, you shape how it's remembered. You decide if it's a tale of glory, a warning of zealotry, or a human tragedy wrapped in divine banners. Because the legacy of the Crusades is not in the blood spilled, it is in the choices we make now. How we teach, how we remember, how we believe, and perhaps, most importantly, how we forgive. The political resonance of the Crusades echoes not just in textbooks or theology, but in speeches, wars, and ideologies even today. During conflicts in the Middle East, some Western leaders invoked crusader language, sometimes carelessly, sometimes intentionally. The term sparked fury. It reminded millions of history not healed, but reopened. Extremist groups, too, draw on crusader imagery, but to invert it. Propaganda from Al-Qaeda and ISIS refers to Western troops as crusaders, casting modern geopolitics in medieval armor. This framing fuels cycles of violence, where ancient grievances are grafted onto current conflicts. When history is weaponized, truth is the first casualty. Yet not all is grim. Pilgrimages continue not for conquest, but for peace. Christians still walk to Jerusalem, Muslims to Mecca, Jews to the Western Wall, and some walk not out of faith, but out of curiosity, seeking understanding instead of victory. Academia offers fresh hope. Collaborative projects between Western and Middle Eastern scholars are reframing the Crusades not as East versus West, but as complex entanglements of trade, culture, and belief. Research highlights cooperation amid war, medical knowledge exchanged, prisoners ransomed respectfully, letters of diplomacy written in mutual reverence. In art, the Crusades are being reimagined. Novels, graphic literature, and video games explore alternate narratives. What if peace had been brokered? What if Saladin and Richard had allied? These imaginings do not rewrite history. They illuminate it, revealing how choice, not destiny, carved the path. And in homes, perhaps most quietly, stories passed down shift tone. Grandfathers once told tales of hero knights and holy wars. Now, parents explain the cost of zealotry. They teach children that faith can build, not just divide. That's the true legacy worth pursuing. Even the landscape itself remembers. Crumbling fortresses dot the Levant's silent witnesses to battles fought centuries ago. Some are preserved, others reclaimed by vines and dust. Tourists climb their towers, unaware they walk upon stones that once echoed with screams and prayers. Guides narrate dates and sieges, but the wind carries what cannot be said. In these ruins, the line between reverence and forgetting grows thin. Should these places be museums, shrines? Should they be left to erode as a gesture of peace, or preserved as warnings carved into stone? The answer shifts with each generation. Meanwhile, theologians wrestle with the paradox of holy war. Can war ever be sacred? Can faith justify the sword? The Crusades remain a case study in the collision of belief and brutality, devotion twisted into domination. Today's religious leaders often cite the Crusades not to vindicate action, but to caution humility. To remember that conviction without compassion leads to catastrophe. In recent years, documentaries, podcasts, and public debates have reignited interest in this medieval past. And not just in the West, in Turkey, Syria, Egypt, nations whose ancestors saw the other side of the sword, there's a rising desire to reclaim their version of the story. No longer the enemy, but participants with names, families, and faith. This is the power of history told well, not to pick sides, but to restore complexity. As our world faces new divisions, ideological, political, digital, the lessons of the Crusades whisper louder. That righteous certainty is dangerous, that the path to violence is often paved with sermons. And that healing requires more than memory. it requires courage. So as the final bells toll on this story of cross and sword, remember the past is not past. It lives in how we speak, whom we trust, and what we fight for. You have now traveled through fire and faith, betrayal and belief, across centuries of blood and hope. May we tell these stories not to repeat them, but to rise beyond them. When the final banners were lowered and the holy vows of conquest faded into dusty corridors of history, the world that emerged was not the one that had stood before. Though the battle cries of crusaders ceased, their legacy rippled through centuries across cultures, borders, and belief systems. The Crusades did not achieve their stated goals. Jerusalem, though captured multiple times, would not remain under Christian control. Edessa was never regained. But the unintended consequences, the tectonic shifts in power, culture, and commerce, would redefine both East and West. In Europe, the Crusades cracked open the tightly sealed lid of feudal isolation. Thousands who had never traveled beyond their village walls returned with new tastes, new ideas, and new ambitions. Silk, sugar, and spices teased their palates and imaginations. Contact with the Islamic world, though often hostile, also sparked intellectual curiosity. Scholars in Muslim Spain had preserved and expanded upon the works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy. These texts, along with advancements in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, flowed back to Europe through the ports of Sicily, Venice, and Marseille. Trade networks flourished. Italian city-states like Genoa and Venice grew rich, supplying crusaders and exploiting new maritime routes. These cities transitioned from regional hubs to global powers, forging the early architecture of European capitalism. Banking emerged to finance long voyages and risky ventures. Letters of credit replaced raw coin, and with trade came cities vibrant, complex, and increasingly independent. The nobility, meanwhile, was transformed. Many aristocratic houses were extinguished on Levantine battlefields or bankrupted by the costs of war. In their absence, power began to consolidate in the hands of kings. The monarchies of England and France, once loosely held alliances of barons, evolved into more centralized states able to tax, to conscript, to legislate. Yet power never travels alone. It invites questions. In these newly empowered monarchies, governance took on new urgency. The administrative tools needed to raise armies for Jerusalem were now used to manage roads, markets, and courts. The seeds of nationhood once scattered found soil. War had unified kings and nobles against a common enemy. Peace required new justifications for loyalty and taxation. Religion, once the unchallenged authority, began to be scrutinized. The failure of successive crusades and the evident piety of the Muslims they fought created cracks in the church's monopoly on truth. Why had God not granted victory to his chosen? Why did noble martyrs fall while infidels triumphed quietly at first, and then more loudly? Thinkers began to separate faith from power, salvation from sword. The universities, born partly from the intellectual stirrings ignited by the Crusades, hosted debates that a century prior would have been unthinkable. In Paris and Oxford, theologians and philosophers examined translations of Aristotle and the commentaries of Islamic scholars like Averroes and Avicenna. The scholastic movement emerged, attempting to reconcile reason and revelation, faith and logic. It would be a slow, painful process, but from it would come Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, and the intellectual scaffolding of modern Western thought. The Crusades also contributed, paradoxically, to Europe's internal secularization. The authority of the Pope, once so commanding that he could summon kings to his call, began to erode. Failed expeditions, political manipulations, and the bloody excesses of crusader armies left a bitter taste. In the 14th and 15th centuries, rival popes would be installed in Rome and Avignon. Councils would be called. Reforms demanded. The Protestant Reformation, still distant, would find fertile ground in the questions the Crusades had raised but not answered. Outside Europe, the Islamic world also changed, though fractured politically. The Muslim response to the Crusades had unified disparate peoples under the banner of jihad. The memory of Frankish incursions lingered long after the last Crusader bastion fell. Saladin became a cultural hero, not just for his victories, but for his chivalry, an image later romanticized in both East and West. The Mamluks of Egypt and later the Ottoman Turks would carry forward the mantle of Muslim resistance and dominance. By the 15th century, as Europe emerged from the medieval fog, the Ottoman Empire had risen as a true superpower. It would conquer Constantinople, dominate the Eastern Mediterranean, and stand as a bulwark against European expansion for centuries. Ironically, the Crusades meant to push Islam back had helped concentrate Islamic power more tightly than before. Meanwhile, in the minds of explorers and monarchs, the world grew smaller. Maps grew more detailed, compasses more reliable, with the Holy Land no longer a viable dream. Europe's gaze turned west to the Atlantic. The same maritime skills honed in Crusader fleets would carry Columbus to the New World. The age of exploration, colonization, and empire was the Crusades' distant cousin, driven by gold, gospel, and glory. And in those ships bound for distant shores sailed not only goods and soldiers, but ideas, some Crusader-born. The notion of sacred conquest, once forged on the plains of Antioch or beneath the walls of Jerusalem, found new expression in the Americas. Missionaries baptized with one hand while conquistadors killed with the other. The rhetoric of holy war was recycled this time. The heathens were not Saracens, but the Aztecs and the Incas. The Crusades had taught Europe how to rationalize brutality in the name of salvation. It would apply that lesson far and wide. But something else had traveled with the Crusaders besides zeal and steel. Contact with the Islamic world had revealed a civilization that, in many ways, eclipsed Europe in learning, science, and urbanity. Arab medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and architecture left deep impressions. The works of Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Ptolemy preserved in Arabic returned to Europe, retranslated into Latin. This knowledge would fuel the early sparks of the Renaissance. Hospitals, once rare, spread across European cities, modeled partly after their more advanced Islamic counterparts. Algebra and Arabic numerals began to replace cumbersome Roman calculations. Paper, introduced from the East, revolutionized communication. Without the Crusades, Gutenberg's press, still a century away, might have found less fertile ground. Culturally, too, the Crusades lingered. They left behind not just ruins and records, but an aesthetic. Gothic architecture borrowed from the pointed arches of the Levant. Crusader songs, lace, and chanson echoed with Eastern motifs. Even chivalry, that ever-slippery concept, absorbed elements from Muslim codes of conduct. A paradox emerged: those who fought each other often admired one another, and perhaps most enduring of all was the memory. The Crusades became legend. Their stories, some true, many invented, shaped the medieval imagination. Poets told of noble deaths. Chroniclers painted villains and saints. Over time, reality blurred with myth. By the 19th century, in the Age of Empire, Europe would resurrect these tales, not as history, but as justification. French generals in Algeria cited the Crusades as precedent. British politicians spoke of defending the Holy Land once more. Flags changed, but the rhetoric remained. In the Middle East, too, memory endured. Though often dormant, it could flare. The word crusader gained power again in the colonial era, and in modern times has been repurposed by extremists and demagogues alike. The Crusades remain, even now, a battlefield of interpretation. Yet for most people in the medieval world, peasant, merchant, mason, the Crusades were distant. They felt their effects in taxes, in sermons, in the faces of returning men. But they did not see Jerusalem. Their lives were ploughed in fields and folded into prayers. The Crusades were, for many, just another war among many, bloody, expensive, and confusing. Still, they mattered. They changed Europe not always for the better, but undeniably. They connected worlds, collapsed others, and forced a continent to redefine power, purpose, and piety. As Europe stumbled into the late Middle Ages, the changes wrought by the Crusades continued to ripple outward. Some were structural, like the weakening of feudal ties, accelerated by nobles who mortgaged lands or perished without heirs on distant campaigns. Others were subtler, cultural tremors that would not be fully felt until centuries later. The military orders Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights evolved, no longer crusading across deserts. Many entrenched themselves in European politics, banking, and fortress building. The Templars became so wealthy and influential that in 1307 King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to them, orchestrated their suppression. He did not merely dissolve a military order, he sent a message about the volatility of mixing religion, warfare, and finance. But perhaps most transformative was how the Crusades had expanded Europe's worldview. For centuries, the Christian West had been largely insular, culturally looking inward or only toward Rome. The Crusades forced it outward. Maps became more accurate, not always geographically, but politically. A sense of scale developed. People began to understand the vastness of the Muslim world, the wealth of the East, and the possibilities beyond the Mediterranean. This new outlook didn't vanish with the end of the Crusades. It deepened. European ambition was no longer confined to pilgrimage or conquest alone. Curiosity grew alongside zeal. Trade routes reopened. Marco Polo's tales of Asia found eager ears. Explorers, monarchs, and merchants began dreaming not just of salvation, but of spices, silks, and gold. The age of exploration was born in the shadow of the Crusades. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached India, he carried a letter from King Manuel I to the local ruler, one that identified Portugal as the vanguard of Christian expansion. The language echoed crusader declarations. When Columbus sailed westward in 1492, he imagined finding a route to the Grand Khan, perhaps even enlisting him in a new crusade against Islam. And when Cortés landed in Mexico, he planted a cross and drew his sword symbols as old as the First Crusade. The legacy of religious war had become a template for empire. But history is not a straight line, it's a web. And while the Crusades provided pathways to expansion, they also left Europe wounded. The massacres of Jews in the Rhineland during the First Crusade later echoed in further pogroms hardened anti-Semitism into a feature of European culture. The siege of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade irreparably damaged East-West Christian unity, turning the Eastern Orthodox Church from ally to other. These fractures would not heal. They would deepen through schism, through reformation, through centuries of mistrust, and even as new empires rose, so too did new enemies. The Ottomans, rising from the ashes of the Seljuks and other Anatolian beyliks, forged a new Islamic empire, one that would do what no other Muslim force had done since the Rashidun Caliphate threatened all of Europe. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the cries were familiar. Another holy city, another loss. Yet this time, there was no crusade. The West had changed. Papal calls for new crusades rang hollow. Europe was fractured between kingdoms, between the Latin and Greek churches, between old loyalties and new ambitions. The Reformation loomed. Faith itself would soon become the battlefield again, not between religions, but within them. The crusading spirit, once forged in sermons and sharpened in steel, had become a relic, revered, remembered, but no longer rallied around. Still, it had left its mark. In architecture, in chronicles, in the very bones of cities rebuilt with spoils, in the memory of peoples divided by faith and bound by blood. The age of the Crusades ended, but their echoes carried on in colonization, in conflict, in the mythologies nations told themselves. The sword and the cross had once marched together. Now they would drift apart, yet never fully separate. The fall of the Crusader states marked not a clean end, but a transformation in how Christendom perceived itself and its role in the world. The days of papal armies sweeping toward Jerusalem with hymns on their lips had passed. In their place rose something more complex, a Europe fractured, yet awakening, bloodied, yet hungry for new dominion, not in God's name alone, but in prophets. In Iberia, the spirit of crusade took a new form, the Reconquista, the long push to reclaim the peninsula from Islamic rule, already centuries old by the time of the First Crusade, intensified. With the fall of Granada in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella could claim not just victory, but divine favor. That same year, they would sponsor Columbus's voyage west, linking the conclusion of a holy war to the dawn of global conquest. But beyond Europe's borders, memory of the Crusades remained vivid and bitter. In the Islamic world, the word crusade would evolve into a symbol of Western aggression. While medieval Muslims often saw the Crusaders as one of many foreign invaders, later narratives, especially during colonial encounters, framed them as the beginning of a long pattern of interference, of outsiders bearing swords and Bibles. This divergence in memory would have consequences. While the West romanticized the Crusades in chivalric tales and stained glass windows, the East often remembered them as brutal, irrational invasions. The tension would not vanish. In fact, echoes of crusade rhetoric can still be heard today in political speeches, in propaganda, in the very language used to justify conflict. Yet it would be unfair to frame the Crusades only as wars of hate. They were also encounters. In the ports of the Levant, Arab and Frank, Turk and Armenian, Greek and Latin crossed paths. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they intermarried. In places like Acre and Antioch, a hybrid culture briefly blossomed, part Crusader castle, part Eastern bazaar. Knowledge moved too. The Crusaders brought back more than relics. They carried architectural techniques, military innovations, and whether they knew it or not, philosophical and medical ideas preserved by Islamic scholars. Though the translation movement had begun earlier in Muslim Spain, Crusader contact accelerated European interest in Arabic texts, and perhaps most ironically, in the centuries after the Crusades ended, it was not Jerusalem, but classical Athens that became Christendom's obsession. The rediscovery of ancient Greek texts, many preserved through Arabic translations, would ignite the Renaissance. Europe's gaze shifted from the Holy Sepulchre to human reason, from saints to scholars. Still, the legacy of the Crusades lingered in statues, in songs, in stories told by firesides. Kings boasted of Crusader ancestors. Knights modelled themselves on Richard the Lionheart. Even those who never left Europe internalized the imagery of crosses and swords, of Saracens and saviors, and when new wars came, whether against Ottomans, Protestants, or colonial subjects, the old language returned. The crusade became a metaphor for purity, for righteousness, for holy mission, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic, always powerful, even into the modern age. The word crusade retained its edge. Politicians invoked it, poets twisted it, historians wrestled with it. Was it a holy war, a proto-colonial venture, a spiritual awakening, or a historical tragedy wrapped in religious cloth? The truth is, it was all of these, and more. The world the Crusades left behind was not holier, not safer, but it was more connected. Europe emerged from its shell pained. changed, and poised to reshape the globe. As Europe moved beyond the medieval era, the legacy of the Crusades found new life in art, literature, and ideology. The Renaissance, while grounded in classical revival, often reinterpreted Crusader motifs through a new lens. Painters like Paolo Uccello and Piero della Francesca depicted battles in stylized, almost mythic fashion. Writers such as Torquato Tasso in Jerusalem Delivered reimagined the Crusades as romantic epics, blurring the line between history and fantasy. In architecture, echoes of the Holy Land lingered. Gothic cathedrals bore influences from Eastern design's pointed arches, elaborate tracery, even domes. Churches across France and England claimed relics brought back from Jerusalem, whether genuine or not. The cult of saints shifted to include Crusader martyrs, pilgrimages, once a core justification for the Crusades, now mingled with tourism and penance. But beneath the aesthetic lay a deeper political transformation. The papacy. Once the engine of crusading fervour began to lose its grip over Europe's kings. The Avignon papacy and subsequent schism weakened ecclesiastical authority, just as secular monarchs grew more centralised and ambitious. Where once popes had commanded armies, now they bargained with sovereign states. The Ottoman Empire's rise would become the new Eastern threat and a new pretext for invoking crusading language. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the cry of crusade was raised again, though it now sounded less like zeal and more like habit. European powers, fractured and often at odds, rarely mounted united campaigns. Instead, battles like Lepanto in 1571 became the exception, not the rule. Trade, however, thrived. The Venetian and Genoese merchants who had once ferried crusaders now carried spices, silk, and knowledge. As maritime empires emerged, Portugal, Spain, later the Dutch and English, the mindset of crusading adapted. Missions to Christianize the New World bore similarities to the old campaigns in Palestine, a mix of faith, conquest, and cultural arrogance. In the Americas, conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro drew on crusader imagery, seeing indigenous peoples as infidels and their quests as divinely sanctioned. The language of the cross and the sword sailed with them rebranded, perhaps, but not forgotten. By the Enlightenment, scholars began to reassess the Crusades critically. Figures like Voltaire and Gibbon saw them as foolish, barbaric, even emblematic of religion's excesses. The Crusader ceased to be a hero and became a cautionary tale of fanaticism, of wasted blood, of moral blindness. Yet the pendulum would swing again. In the 19th century, European powers colonizing the Middle East revived the Crusader legacy not in prayer, but in propaganda. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt invoked Crusader roots. The French seizure of Algeria and British presence in Palestine were sometimes framed in redemptive terms, echoing medieval ambition, cloaked in modern rationale. And then came the 20th century. 2 world wars shattered the romanticism of conflict. The idea of holy war, whether Islamic jihad or Christian crusade, became suspect, then inflammatory. Historians grew more nuanced, more critical, but also more aware of the Crusades' enduring mythos. In popular culture, the Crusades remain potent. Films like Kingdom of Heaven reinterpret their events through contemporary morality. Video games, novels, and documentaries revisit the era sometimes accurately, often not, but always with fascination. The symbol of the knight with the red cross endures, even if few understand its full weight. And in geopolitics, the term crusade remains explosive. When President George W. Bush referred to the war on terror as a crusade, backlash was immediate and fierce, especially in the Muslim world, where centuries-old wounds still throbbed. Yet even amidst misunderstanding and misuse, the Crusades offer lessons about faith and power, about fear and encounter. about the peril of seeing the world in absolutes. The sword and the cross once carved borders in blood, but they also forged connections accidental, uneasy, but enduring. What remains now is not the call to arms, but the call to understand, to trace the paths of pilgrims and princes, not to relive their wars, but to learn from their choices, to hear the silence in abandoned castles and the echo in ancient prayers. And so, the Crusades faded from history, not with a final trumpet blast or a decisive peace, but with silence. The camps were emptied, the crosses no longer stitched to surcoats, and the roads to Jerusalem became less travelled by soldiers and more by memory. But the questions they raised endured. What happens when faith and power entwine too tightly? What does it mean to call a war holy? And what remains after centuries of bloodshed done in the name of salvation? In the Muslim world, the memory of the Crusades never entirely dimmed. Chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir and Usama ibn Munkid preserved stories of resistance and endurance. These narratives, often neglected in Western history books, painted the Crusaders not as heroes, but as brutal invaders, strange, aggressive, and relentless. The wounds of conquest left deep cultural scars, and even today, echoes of those centuries-old conflicts surface in rhetoric, politics, and perception. The Crusades also had consequences for Jewish communities. Positioned between Christian and Muslim worlds, Jews often became scapegoats. Pogroms accompanied Crusader departures, especially in the Rhineland. Accused of sorcery, betrayal, or simply of being other, thousands were slaughtered. These early mass persecutions foreshadowed a long, dark trajectory of anti-Semitism in Europe. Yet amidst the destruction, there were paradoxes. Cross-cultural exchanges occurred even in war. European knights adopted Eastern military tactics, and Arab scholars transmitted Greek philosophical texts to the West via Arabic translations, in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Crusaders learned from those they fought. The very clash of civilizations opened unseen doors. Over time, the Crusades transformed from lived experience to legend. In medieval romances, the Holy Land became a backdrop for chivalric exploits and supernatural events. Sir Gawain met Saracens in distant lands. Charlemagne battled Muslims long after his death. Truth blended with myth until both became indistinguishable in popular memory. In some cases, this myth-making served political ends. During the Reformation, Protestant writers accused Catholics of papist crusading zeal. During the French Revolution, radicals condemned the Crusades as a symbol of church tyranny. In the 20th century, some nationalist movements co-opted Crusader imagery to promote ideological purity, twisting the past into a weapon. But in quieter places, in cloisters, in universities, in homes filled with dusty books, the study of the Crusades continued to mature. Scholars questioned sources, examined both sides, and sought to untangle piety from propaganda. The Crusades were no longer viewed as just wars or as evil campaigns, but as complex, human events driven by faith, yes, but also by fear, greed, ambition, and hope. And so, today, when we speak of the Crusades, we must do so with care, not to glorify, not to condemn blindly, but to understand, to see the Crusades not just as European expeditions, but as global moments where worlds collided, sometimes violently, sometimes fruitfully, where identities were tested, where boundaries were drawn and redrawn, where history itself was altered, and perhaps most importantly, to see in the Crusades a mirror of what we once were, of what we might become again, if we forget how easily righteousness can slide into ruin.